How about let's dig into some of the history of Christianity. Um, could you can you give us an synopsis of how it
Hmm.
started?
Okay, so like I would say, honestly, Christianity actually, well, technically starts in Paul's day already, not officially. So I need to clarify this because people might say, "Oh, but you said it doesn't start then." Let me clarify this. When Paul writes the book of Romans, actually, the core reason of why Paul writes the book of Romans is because Jews had been kicked out of certain Roman provinces because there was always some conflict between Rome and passionate Jews ready for the Messiah to come. And at the time of Paul writing this, the laws had changed and Jews were allowed to come back into Roman provinces. So what's happening now is in the time that Jews were expelled, Christianity, I shouldn't use that term, Paul's gospel, let me use the words he uses. He doesn't say Christianity. He speaks of his gospel, and he speaks of his gospel not having come to him by man, it was given to him by the Spirit, which, okay, is its own interesting issue. So in Paul's gospel, Gentiles get, and this is the important thing, Gentiles get actually to join Judaism. Paul's defense Paul's defense of Gentiles was to say, hey, Caleb, you can get in without having to get circumcised. And I don't think people who read Paul are grasping that actually. He's not inviting them into some separate religion. He's saying you can join Judaism without getting circumcised. Now, in that wake of that time when the Jews were not being able to practice Judaism in Roman space, Gentiles flourished and they came in and they became the core group. Now imagine if Jews get to come back into their own space. This is going to be conflict because the Jews are like, well, we're being outnumbered by people who are not Jews. You're telling us they're not part of our community, but they outnumber us. That's a threatening position to be in. And so what you're reading in Romans is Paul defending both sides in a way. In one way, saying to the Gentiles, okay, you can come in, but stop getting too boastful or cocky. That's Romans 9 to 11, because ironically, the covenants are still in place. That's what Paul's effectively saying. But to the Jews who are getting boastful and wanting to force circumcision on the Gentiles, Paul is saying, you are not the only kind of sons of Abraham anymore. Now, you think about Paul's writing when he talks about Abraham, and that you can see he plays both sides like a good lawyer because he says, yes, Abraham matters when you're Jewish. He says that in Romans 3 and Romans 9. And then he also says, no, being a physical son of Abraham is not the only way anymore to be considered part of the commonwealth of Israel. Now I'm almost preaching, not preaching, like going into exposition. Yes, I'll try and stop that. But the point is, at that point in Rome, Christianity's grassroots are starting, where Gentiles, and the core of it is Gentiles getting arrogant. To summarize it in Paul's terms, Gentiles are getting boastful against the root. And that's why Paul has to say to the Gentiles, don't get arrogant. You are not the root. Now, Caleb, that's replacement theology. So if I look at it in its honest inception point, it was happening. It wasn't formalized then, but it started happening then. The next big event where it gets to happen, I would say, is with Polycarp. Now, Polycarp is the main disciple of John who wrote Revelation. Now, when Polycarp was around, Rome had now established itself as a religious um, institution which would become Christianity. And not so ironically, what's the most successful and long standing Christian denomination? Roman Catholicism, because it comes from there. Polycarp and Anicetus, who was a Roman bishop, couldn't agree, again on a core Jewish issue like Passover, and that's where big split came. I would say that's one of the key, like put a pin on the timeline moments when Christianity got its first serious injection to become, this is a real thing that's going to happen now. Of course, it takes some time. You take about 3 centuries, and you end up with Constantine, who has the Council of Nicaea. By this point, uh, Gentiles who are following Jesus within Christianity are causing such a problem. And here's the irony, that that council dealt with a couple of theological issues. They had to counter heresies, which thank God they did, because it would have allowed other nonsense into Christianity, which would make bigger problems for someone like me. But part of what they did there, and this is important to note, is they called all the Christian bishops. They didn't call one Jewish bishop to that meeting, deliberately. And part of what they did at that council was to actually outlaw Sabbath observance and Passover. So if you want, for me, the more definitive, well, there it is in black and white in history. It becomes official in 324 AD.